Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kaveh, and I'll be discussing a diverse array of subjects that span from my experiences in the emergency room to the furthest reaches of the universe. I'll be hosting guests, inviting illuminating conversations that at times may challenge ways of thinking or being, while also nurturing curiosity, meaning, and awe into life. Please consider subscribing, liking, saving, or sharing this podcast with any of your friends or family if it feels right for you. Thank you for taking the time. Let's dive into the podcast. Hey everyone, thank you again for tuning into the podcast. My guest this week is Gabrielle Pelicci, Ph.D. She wrote a riveting book called All This Healing Is Killing Me, and I feel that it's a book that resonates with a lot of people who are going down the healing process, doing work to better themselves and have greater capacity to maybe not be so stuck with things from the past. The book is harrowing, and I'm so surprised at how effective she reaches a climax near the end of the book, surprisingly, rather than when people are coming back down. And this podcast was a primer for how she came about it, what her life experience was, and I feel that the book really translates as a testament to the life experience that she had. Please enjoy this podcast. If it resonates with you, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing it with anyone that you feel it may be of benefit. And I look forward to discussing anything that comes up with you through messaging. Have a beautiful day. All right, Gabrielle Pelicci.
Exactly.
I grew up on a soccer team that had Italians, so the cadence and tone had so much passion in how the dialogue was. And then you look up, and a lot of how, at least where I am in Canada, there's this relative monotony to the conversation. And I don't know if this is a product of how we engage with tech, or if it's just when you have so many cultures that come together and clash, the tendency is to pause in my expression of how I naturally am, see if I'm safe, and then come back to being in that full expression. But if you maintain your culture and you just embody it all the way through, the Italians are the first to meet you with all the passion, the hands, and potentially a little slap from time to time if you're out of line.
There was a lot of yelling when I was young, some good, some bad, but for sure you had to compete to be heard. So I have a lot of gesture and volume and animation, which makes me a really good storyteller. There's something called the Moth, which is a global storytelling event, and I've won the Moth a couple of times because I can tell a really good story.
And this is something that's coming around right now, that I'm seeing people reclaiming their capacity to share their story. Is their story safe to share? Is their story safe to even embody in them? I'm joined with Gabrielle Pelicci, Ph.D., on the next episode of the Layered Prescriptions podcast. And I'm really grateful to have you here. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is a delight to spend some time with you.
Yeah, thank you. And we're in the presence of, she just shared that she is the winner of a storytelling competition called The Moth. And how did you come about that? Where did you find that there was the value and necessity for it? And what was the subject that you talked about first that was a story that you brought to the world? And what did it mean to you? That's layered.
That's a lot of questions. I was going through a phase. It was about 7 or 8 years ago, and I had started a business. I was an entrepreneur. I was doing all the traditional things for sales and marketing, but I was feeling like I needed to have a better confidence in my public speaking, and I joined some improv classes, and I was doing improv classes. And then the Moth came around, and I've always loved stories, and I decided to give it a try. And the first story I ever told was the most embarrassing thing I ever did for money. And you can listen to that story on YouTube. It's the story of a foot fetish party that I attended.
Oh, wow.
And the audience went wild. And I'm actually funny. I have, there's something, I don't know how it happened, but there was a lot of laughter and a lot of joy. And I was like, oh, this is good. And then I returned again a few months later, and I told a story about a priest, which was also very funny and won me another Moth event. And just most recently, about a month ago, I told a story about a llama farm that I was living on, and that was pretty comical as well.
Wow.
I don't know, it was accidental and also so satisfying. There's something about storytelling that I think is really meaningful. I did my dissertation about women healers from
Hmm.
all different cultures all over the world, and I used narrative analysis as my methodology, meaning I looked at their stories and I looked for themes in their stories. And I devour memoirs and I devour personal stories. So I think it's just something that has a lot of value for me personally.
That's absolutely beautiful to hear. And as you were sharing that, I was picturing you up on stage and wondering, because I was wondering if there was anyone who was that you were longing for to be in the audience. And is there anyone that maybe you were terrified that if you were there, that if they were there, you would have to change the tone of the story? Is there anyone that stands out for you in those moments, or was there anyone that your heart was beating in the possibility?
I think what's ironic, and this is pretty counterintuitive, is that when I'm performing, I'm a lot less nervous than I am in my writing. I think in my writing, I just wrote this book, All This Healing's Killing Me, where I tell
Yeah.
all the things that I don't want anyone to know about me. And in the writing of that story, the level of anxiety was so severe that it took me 15 years to birth the book, that there was just so much. But I could pretty easily, if you put me in a group, tell one of those stories. Not all of them, some of them are more challenging than others, but for some reason, I don't know if it's being in community or if it's the intimacy of the group, that it just flows a little bit easier for me. I don't know.
You've written an important book, and the title alone. So the book, "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel Van Der Kolk, has an immediate acknowledgement that is so profound that when I speak about it in the ER with patients, you see a shift within them. And your title is, you nailed it with that as well too. All of this healing is killing me. And there's this renaissance of healing from healing that I really appreciate how you were succinct in that. And I think that as more and more people come upon it and in the story form come to the lessons that land particular with them in relation to what you experienced and how you perceived yourself in the world, there's going to be an amazing reclamation for them that starts just with that title that invites them in.
Yeah, the title has a resonance that was very unexpected. I was at this conference called South by Southwest in Austin last month, and women were coming up to me being like, "Are you the woman that wrote that book?" I was like, and they're like, "Me and my friends were just talking about the title." Like, the title has some kind of impact, and it's super exciting. And it's exciting to hear how people interpret it and what it means to them and what it evokes. And my passion above all else is to evoke something from people when I do my work. So if I'm writing, I want to evoke within you a desire to tell your stories. And I don't want to just be producing things that people consume. It's the same with my teaching. I teach a methodology called transformative learning, which is what I studied in my doctoral program. The idea is that it's evoking some kind of change, and it's not just informational learning. You're not just receiving something, but it's activating you. And somehow the title is activating people. And that's really fun.
If I can interpret it, because when you reached out to me and I read the title, I thought when people are in their 11th hour and they need some support that's outside of themselves, they talk as if there's someone else in the room. And it's a part of us that's almost yearning for the resolution of a pain or a burden that they're feeling. And some may go to church, some may go to the mosque, some may go to their religious house in order to connect to the God within themselves. And when you lift your head up again and the consensus suggestibility of the people around you are saying, oh, this modality is what works, this one does that. The people doing the thing in order to get to a thing rather than doing the thing just to be immersed in the thing, I think at some point get so frustrated and they ask to this higher power, or they make a declaration that all of this healing is killing me. And you
Mm-hmm.
can feel the weight and the burden. And there's almost a part that witnesses itself within you that feels that now that I have just externalized this, it's off of my chest, the burden, to a certain degree, and you're more available to the actual components of what healing is. I find that title is going to be resonating in a lot of people's psyches because it's been there before and said by themselves to themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very generous description. It's also, on the lighter side, a tongue-in-cheek version of, oh God, like I have to go to another therapy session. I have to go to another ayahuasca retreat. I have to go to another, really?
Yeah.
So within the title, there is a profound interpretation. And there's also the memes on the internet of a child on a roller coaster being like, my guides are making me do this. Yeah, it's appropriate that we're on the layered podcast because I think there's layers in the title, and I think there's different layers of meaning that you can
Yeah.
find within it.
Yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that, because everyone who is listening to this or we walk among has so many layers to them, but they have leading parts that are the parts of them that felt that I need to cope this way in order to address the world here. And if the environment hasn't been reclaimed as being safe, many parts of them are living as if the past where something was challenging continues today. And then there's these gifts of an individual that you may come across. And I hope this podcast is one space of many where the individual feels this person embodies so many layers to them and they're feeling safe in what they embody. And in that invitation, they share a story that's challenging, real, and raw, and potentially vulnerable. And wait, they're not terrified of sharing that vulnerability. What a gift. And then they're welcomed back into the layers of reconsideration of themselves. And we jumped into it, and I wanted to acknowledge like the layers of you that has gone through your own personal journey, and then made a declaration that said, I want to deepen my understanding through the education that is available. And then there was an education that's outside of what's Western medicine and a Western world available that's gaining popularity now. And my hope, my dream, my wish is that it comes forward with a great deal of reverence, integrity, and humility to what it invites forward. Because the challenge that I see on the other side is for every tool, there's a human being that's ready to abuse it. And if there are not strong foundations and pillars, this too can be taken as an opportunity for human beings to reclaim the connection with themselves. And what you had shared, that you had done your PhD and a dissertation in women's healing, was so beautiful to witness, because I didn't know that documentation exists that long back. Though my fiance, for example, will talk about how the women that were witches were persecuted, but the story sounds like they were making these bizarre concoctions. I would venture to guess that you have a lot more insight, that they were doing things with greater authenticity, and it was confronting to a lot of the systems that were in control at that time. So in your women's healing, what drew you towards women's healing? And was there a particular women's healer that you feel stood out that really resonates with you to this day?
Yeah, you just said like 10 amazing things.
Sorry. This is the cacophony of my psyche, especially after night shifts. So I
So
apologize in advance.
I'm gonna address three of them specifically. The first
All
thing
right.
I want to address is what you said with regards to how I'm showing up now. And we couldn't have had this conversation a few years ago. I wasn't the same person a few years ago. And I think that's a testament to healing and personal growth work. And I think it's why you do it, because you wouldn't have liked me very much a few years ago. I didn't like me very much a few years ago. And I couldn't have been so transparent and so raw and so vulnerable, these things that people are admiring. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing was with regards to this renaissance that's happening in medicine and the things that are now emerging. I do think that we need to have a lot of reverence and delicacy as we're bringing them forward. I work at a company called Third Wave that
Mhm.
does education around psychedelic use and how we engage in those experiences, who supports us, how we integrate it. And I do think we need to bring a high level of mindfulness and respect. So I just wanted to share that I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. And then with regards to the women healers, I cover this pretty extensively in the book. It started with a mystical experience that I had at my mother's funeral. So
Mm.
my mom died when I was 21, and she floated out of her body and started talking to me. And at the time, I was like, oh God, what's happening? I had no idea what was happening. I went to the library. This was like pre-internet, and I was like looking up books from Tibetan Book of the Dead to whatever I could find. I was like trying to figure out how this was possible. And I knew that it was happening. It was a very definite experience. I wasn't confused. It was definitely happening. And then I started going to therapy, but I wouldn't tell anybody what was happening. In fact, it was probably at least a decade later before I told anybody, if not longer. And so I think my mother, I had learned through different healers that my mother was in a spiritual contract with me to advise me from the other side. And she guided me towards all of these different healing modalities. And I suspect it's just because I've been doing them for lifetimes. And this is just a continual unfolding because the healing modalities are so intuitive to me. Everything from energy medicine to body work to all different kinds of meditation and yoga. All of it is who I am more than what I do. And as part of
Mhm.
that, I wanted to study who all the women healers were because with the witch hunts that you mentioned, there was not only a destruction of the women, but there was also a destruction of a lot of the knowledge and the stories and the traditions. And
Mm.
I wanted to find them. And it was actually really hard. When I was doing my dissertation, I kept going to my advisor and being like, am I failing to use the online database correctly? Like, and he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, where are the stories? I can't find the stories because they're not there. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And so I was digging and I would find like one obscure memoir here or there. And I would find like one obscure essay here or there. And I was so frustrated and it made me really mad. And I've always been a feminist. Like, my first career ever was fashion modeling, if you can believe that. And I emerged from that with an eating disorder. And then I started writing about how the media perpetuates body dysmorphia and eating disorders and things. And then in my master's program, I was working in technology and I was looking at the gaps in gender around technology. And so I was always a feminist, but this like really pissed me off. I was like,
As it should.
women have been doctors for like millennia. Where are the stories? And so that was the foundation of the academic work that I decided to pursue.
So where did you end up discovering it? Because I can share in that frustration when we're looking for something that especially we know will unlock so much truth and maybe relatability for why we are where we are right now. And there's a potential solution that at least softens me into my own personal experience. Where did you end up discovering it? And was it in books or was it in the presence of others who maybe had to pass down the stories in ways that were not available in the books that we had in our regular bookstores?
Yeah, it was both. I went to many different countries. I went all throughout all the countries in Europe. I went to Africa. I went to Asia. I interviewed lots of women. I read hundreds of articles and books, like hundreds. I think by the time I finished writing, there was like 300 or 400 books in my studio apartment. It was just me and
Mhm.
books. Yeah, it was a scavenger hunt is the best way I could describe it. And I think also because of the PTSD of what had happened, women were reluctant to tell their stories. And I think that
Mhm.
it was even challenging to get women that I knew that I had either had as a teacher or had gone to as a healer to tell me their stories. And I felt that same forbiddenness when I was writing my own story. I kept feeling the whole time with every sentence, I'm not supposed to be writing this. I'm not supposed to be writing this. I felt like a sense of doing something terribly taboo. And not only in the sense of, oh, there might be some backlash and I might write some things that reflect badly on my reputation and it might impact my career, like not just in a superficial way, but like in a really deep way of, I'm not supposed to be telling these stories. And I think that's something that still lingers and something that I want to break. And
Mm.
hopefully, I'm a small part of breaking that and opening the
Mhm.
portal for other people, not just women, but anyone to tell their stories.
I've come to realize, and maybe this resonates, that the inner critic, the judging voice that shames, is the internalized voice of other. Have you through this self-discovery discovered whose voice that is that invites that doubt. And it may sound like ours, but it's the reclamation of recognizing the space that, whoa, that's actually the voice of someone that I held in trust before, that may have said a thing that I felt that I have to carry this, that you have reclaimed that torch.
To refer back to the title of your podcast, I think that it's layered. I
Yeah.
think I think it's the tribe. There's something that Elizabeth Gilbert talks about with which is tribal shaming, that your family of origin has a collective story and a collective presentation, representation that they don't want you to betray. And so I think there's betrayal of the tribe, and then I think the collective. I think collectively the amount of effort we have made to hide and pretend and disguise and not be who we really are. Breakthroughs in that with the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter, you see these breakthroughs in that collective shadow. And then I think there's generational trauma that we all carry that shows up as another voice or another layer of resistance. I think there's many layers to it. I think some people attribute it to their own lack of skill or confidence or worthiness or something. And I think that's a misappropriation of all the different layers are operating in our psyche.
Right. And what a time that we are, that to be alive, that one, we live in a time that we're able to have these type of discussions, to explore ourselves and get to know ourselves that way. There's relative safety. And I really stress that, because if someone is listening to this, for example, Congo, and we're hearing about how a lot of the cobalt that powers a lot of our smartphones, rechargeable batteries, originates in place, for example, that has these people working in mines for $1 a day, with mothers with their children on their back. I know that for them, there's an inability to even get into the spaces of consideration like this. So I feel that there's an immense responsibility in addition to the privilege that exists there. And may we seize the opportunity on behalf of them, and in doing that for ourselves, invite spaces for them to support them as well too. I think about that person who's stuck working their 365th day of the year, which does happen in many places of the world still. And you think that back to slavery days, if that was the case, but that still happens in 2023. And I imagine that person in their moment of silence and solitude wondering, is this ever going to end? And, or is there anyone out there who's trying to come and help me, or whatever it may be? And I feel like dialogues like this, that has people reconsider the world outside of their own, allows that breakthrough when it's safe to get out of their own world and then reach out a little further. And eventually that hand is brought forth to where it maybe thought that it would never go. And I think that hand first has to come first to themselves. And it's a world that I'm dreaming of, and the importance of, I feel that these types of dialogues result in presence, that results in actionability, to ultimately invite presence for every human being on earth. There's that saying that there is no peace in the world until everyone has peace. And it's a challenging thing to digest, because when someone is saying, I'm comfortable right now, if they've found a relative space of refuge, there's a world of chaos out there that still is requiring a lot of love and tenderness, and an enormous reorientation of how we perceive what values and metrics in life there are. I'm really looking forward to even blinking and seeing 5 years from now is third wave in Africa and proliferating. And it may not necessarily be the third wave project itself, but the philosophies and foundation of what it invites. And what a time that, and for that reason, I'm saying, what a time for us to be alive, to be able to do work like this. And I'd love to trend into discussing a little bit about how you came upon, let's say, a life. There was a moment before and a moment after, and then we have multiple. But do you remember where that moment was where I am no longer experiencing Gabrielle, or sorry, not, that was a French way of saying it because there's so many French people on.
It's fine.
Gabrielle, was there one defining moment that set you onto the path of, I can no longer be this way or carry this pain the way that I'm carrying it, and the relatability to yourself pivoted?
Yeah. I had a really shitty situation in 2019 happen, and I write about it in the book, so you can read all the gory details. And the Cliff Notes version is I had a really bad relationship, a really bad breakup, and then shortly thereafter, the pandemic hit, And other times in my life, I had such easy bounce backs. I was like the rebound queen. Like I could bounce back from any job loss, any boyfriend, any whatever. And people would always be like, how did she do that?
Mm.
I was like a kangaroo. I'd be on to the next city, on to the next adventure, which I considered both a resilience and a trauma response, but I like to think of it as
Great catch.
resilience.
Great catch.
So I was like a cat, 9 lives. And then something happened in this transition. My body started burning, and it was both a physical burning as well as an energetic burning. I started burning and it wouldn't stop. And it was a few days, and then it was a few weeks, and then it was a few months. And I was literally on fire, some kind of psychic, energetic fire that was just burning down the house. And it was all the beliefs, and it was all the bullshit, and it was the facade, and it was the inauthenticities, and it was the lack of integrity, and it was just all the things. And I had no control over it. And I would say a cliche description might be Dark Night of the Soul or something like that. Something was happening and it was out of my hands. And I was not happy about it. I was not happy about it. And the whole time I kept being like, this is not my life. This is not my life. This is not how we do things. Like I was telling the universe, like, no, this is not happening. And it just kept going on and on. And in it humbles you when you have a physical or mental condition that you cannot manage. There's so much humility in that. And I became more and more humble and started seeking support, healing, lifestyle changes. Oh my God. And found myself living and working, building houses in devastated areas, farming on different properties, shoveling goat shit and harvesting honey from bees. And I found myself going back to a lifestyle that was not something that was part of my upbringing or experience or any way, but felt like this is all I can do right now. All I can do is just have my hands in the dirt and just give up all the other stuff, right? Like I'm no longer fancy PhD anything. I'm no
Mhm.
longer entrepreneur anything. I'm no longer anything. I'm just going back to the most primal lifestyle and so I was volunteering, which is what the llama story was. One of the properties where I lived was a llama farm with 36 llamas. And I did that for a couple of years until I regenerated myself. And during that process, did an herbalism certification, a permaculture certification, started microdosing on psilocybin, started working with peyote with a Native American woman in New Mexico, fell in love with plant medicine, did some ayahuasca ceremonies, and Gabby was gone. The Gabby that was here in 2019, she's not here anymore. She's gone. She's laid to rest. And this version of me is just a completely different version of me. I'd like to think it's a more authentic version of me, but I think authenticity also is kind of one of these buzzwords or hashtags or something that I'm not sure it resonates totally. I think this version of me is the next iteration. It's the version that a lot of us are feeling this calling or this pulling or this experience. I think a lot of us are being attracted something into this next version. And I think it's something a lot of us are sharing. My coworkers at Third Wave have all been through some kind of similar experience. A lot of friends are experiencing something similar. So I suspect it's not just me. I suspect that there's something larger at play.
Yeah. I can imagine when you have no more identities to fall behind, you fall back into yourself. And you either embrace that and you witness the chaos as you're in your abyss or the rock bottom. But I'm hoping that simultaneously we find that space where we're like, I'm dying to the story of who I thought I was. And in that, there's permission to get support as you're supporting yourself through. One of our common friends, Ben, he mentioned to me last year, this was 2022, and we're in our second year at the time of COVID and how we're responding to it. We came upon this realization that we're saying that one of the incredible gifts of being human is our ability to adapt. But one of the perils of being human is our ability to adapt. Meaning, if we are coping from a pain that we're sensing, we can cope all the way down to the bottom. And then we hit this rock bottom when there's nowhere else to cope, nowhere to go, no one to please, and you're utterly with yourself. And the parts of you that in internal family systems, for example, are deemed to be exiles, the parts of us that have been hiding behind the armor that cannot be seen, felt, witnessed, but is yearning to be connected to, finally has either the most fragile and unique, rare opportunity for connection. But the challenge is for a lot of people, if they arrive there and they're unsupported, they sometimes choose to hurt themselves because the burden of the pain that they're feeling, they want it to end, which is how we're wired, but they'll choose to end life or hurt self or hurt other rather than ending the pain. And when you shared that 2019 Gabby is no longer here, I'm curious if it can be worded as your relationship to yourself and your self-perception adapted in such a way that you reclaim the connection with the parts of you that had been longing for it for a very long time. And so it's not that she's no longer here, it's that the armor that she was carrying before is not necessitated as you walk through the world, and a different relatability to it just permeates into all of your life experiences. And she knows where she hurt before and couldn't connect with you now that she can. And there's this that physiological sigh that we hear about that is, I had to go through all of those things in order to get to that place, that fragile place. And in that moment, it sounds like you said yes, and you reclaimed who you are on the other side of all the stories that you tell yourself. And
Yes, I would say it's a both. And
yeah,
this little guy is attacking my table, my desk.
what do you feel
And
when you catch them? Yeah.
I would say it's a both and. I would say yes, part of the integration process that you're describing, the reclaiming process, the stuff that was in the shadow that needed attention. Part of that was I wrote the memoir during the time that I described, and there was a reclamation and an owning and a reconnecting with all of those pieces. So 100% yes. And that's why I say in my bio and other places, I think that writing is medicine. I think it's a powerful form of integration and reclamation. I love writing. I think everyone should be doing it. I think it's really healthy and really helpful. I also think there was something that was destroyed, and I don't know what it was, and maybe armor is a good way to describe it, but it really felt like almost that there was something else inhabiting my skin that was more animated, more alive, more energetically dominant even than armor. Like there really was somebody in there. And my
Mhm.
best friend would often refer to her as Dr. Gabby because Dr. Gabby is kind of like my brand name that I use. And
Yeah.
from time to time, Dr. Gabby would show up, and Dr. Gabby was like manic, panic, anxious, like bulldoze over everybody, had to work all the time, workaholic, like all the things. She had a lot of kind of crazy characteristics.
Mm.
And my friend would be like, tell Dr. Gabby to calm down. You need to eat some lunch. It was like a kind of playful thing between us. But there was some part of my persona that was very present that she's not there anymore. There is a real sense of somebody left the house. And maybe that could be called armor, but there's a spaciousness inside of me that I didn't have before, and a freedom that I didn't have before. I remember right before everything went down, it was maybe like a few months before everything went down, I was having one of my panic attack moments, and I had the thought, I don't want to be afraid anymore. I had spent like 45 years just being afraid all the time. I don't even know what I was afraid of, but I could be afraid of a loud noise. I could be afraid of a coworker. I just felt afraid so much of the time. And I remember having that thought, and I almost dismissed it just as quickly. Oh, like, okay. And I can honestly say I'm not afraid right now. I don't leave the house afraid. I don't wake up afraid. I don't fall asleep afraid. And so there's a very significant shift that's happened. Yeah.
Was there, so it sounds like, so when I say armor, I realize out loud, I'm like, Kaveh, I led 4 years of retreats on IFS. Why am I not using the proper terminology from it, where we say our protective parts, and the protectors within us soften back when they trust that Gabby, who's the conductor, is carrying forward in the way that in greater relation to the parts of us that we were initially scared of having the world see. And I love how deep in that, because you spoke about what you reclaimed specifically, which was the freedom to embrace the world and walk around without having that fear that was there. And there's something to be said about when you're in the midst of a panic attack, where there's this other voice that creeps in and brings a very inquisitive, curiosity invoking question when you feel like you're dying. What a juxtaposition of the psyche in that
Mhm.
moment, and how incredible a testament that it's a testament to how incredibly we are wired. When someone is responding back to that, when they're in that moment, I feel that how society's structured right now and the systems are structured is, as someone is falling into themselves, they'll be latching on to people, places, things, distractions that prevent them from falling completely and wholly into themselves. And a lot of those well-intended healing modalities and structures of support either soften the fall or sometimes rob it completely. And then you have a person that is almost fragmented in the falling back. And I can imagine a lot of them feeling withdrawn. I found myself there personally. And I think as a man, sometimes we want to cradle our partners as we see them going through different challenges and structures, but we know almost that to be there and letting them know and support as they fall, they're not falling and smashing the ground, they're falling back into themselves. And it's a very fragile thing, that not a fragile thing, it's a beautiful thing to witness, especially when you're in a relationship. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on when people are going through healing processes and they're in different stages of relating to themselves in relationship. How does one go about healing in a way that invites their partner to be a support of it and not either hijacking or feeling threatened by it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think all healing happens in relationship, whether it's your romantic partner or your platonic friend or your hired guide, or I think all of it happens in relationship. Nature has become a significant partner for me in my healing journey in recent years. So I think all of healing is happening in partnership, in relationship. In it could be relationship even with yourself and yourself. So I think relationship is a significant part of the process. I think what we lack is masterful relating for anyone who's facing these challenges. I think traditional training, medical training is very reductionistic. It doesn't take really the complexity and the layers, to go back to your podcast, of
On behalf of them, I'm
humans.
sorry.
And my father is a neurologist and psychiatrist, and I've been immersed in the Western medical model for a long time. I've also been immersed in the Eastern model. And I think we've lost a lot of that wisdom, not necessarily skill, but like the wisdom of really holding people in this process, which is one of the questions I was asking the women healers when I was interviewing them. And they kept telling me the way to become a masterful healer is to go through all of these things yourself and get the support that you need, because you can only take people places that you've been. They kept talking about this cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and how it was going to happen over and over again in my lifetime, and that it was something to plan for, and that just by going through that process you were going to be able to hold space and guide others through that process as well. And that's never a language I heard my father talk about, or any Western practitioners. It was like you get to a level of mastery because you get some kind of diploma and you pass some exam and then you're a master, and then you tell everyone how much of a master you. It's just not the same model. And
Yeah.
so I think some of this is an unlearning or an integrating of a different kind of wisdom when it comes to how we hold and support, and what the actual masterful skills are in that relationship. The nice thing about nature, if we model nature as a role model, if you think about your relationship with nature, whenever you're going something through something really terrible, and you go out and you walk with her and you sit with her and you swim in her water and you eat her food, the healing it permeates everything. And it's not a doing, there's not even like a doingness in it, right? There's a beingness in it. Like, she's in her natural rhythms, she knows who she is, she knows that she's nourishing, she holds you, she's always there for you whether you take advantage of her or not. She's steady, she's persistent, she has all the things that you need to feel better. There's something about her, like, that models that behavior really well. I think that's something that we've largely ignored. I think we mostly look to other humans as a model for what a healing relationship should be. And so I think we could expand that and we could look at the earth itself as a model of what we could be. What does that look like in specifics in terms of your partner or somebody that you're trying to hold and support? I think it's there's no one size fits all. I resonate with your description of coming face to face with the work you really need to do and backing up and becoming more and more fragmented and getting close and backing up. I resonate with that kind of two steps forward, one step back process. And I did that a lot. And I also write about a suicide attempt in my book that I had about, oh my God, almost 20 years ago now. And I also felt like the pain was bigger than me and more powerful than me. And there was absolutely no way that I would ever be able to wrestle with it and come out the other side. So I'm familiar with all of those things, all of the fragmentation, all of the intimidation. And I don't think there's any one thing that can help people. And I think that's where formulas are really dangerous and standardization is really dangerous. And for me, the best teacher that I have right now is the earth. It's just the best teacher that I have access to right now, and something that I use more than anything else in my daily self-care, in my meditative practice, in my medicinal practices, in ceremony, in reverence and respect, and some of the things we were talking about earlier. And so that might be difficult to translate into a romantic partnership, but I think that we need to spend time thinking about these things and not just quick fix them. I don't think there's quick fixes. And we have to explore this in the same way that you explore it with Ben. You talked to me about the kind of stuff that you were doing with Ben and the ways that you held, I think you said unconditional witness was the word that you used,
Yeah,
unconditional
unconditional
witness.
witnessing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a beautiful, eloquent description of what we can do with others and what nature is doing with us. That unconditional witness is a fantastic place to start.
Yeah. I think of when you're in nature, you're reminded of the nature within yourself. And if you were to take the other side of that extreme, looks like non-nature. And I feel that very often the hospital is this sterile space that is devoid of nature. There are people who walk from nature among it. And yes, there's parts of the walls that are arguably from it, but the you in relation to it is lost. And so I started saying in the hospital, like the hospital is a sterility, and the opposite of nature is sterility. And there, I envision a day where like the walls dissolve, and while you're in support of people in their greatest time of need, you look up and there's trees around, there's nature. And there's a beautiful book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. And he writes about how there have been efforts in the past to rehumanize and reinstill nature into traditionally caregiving or health settings. And when it would come, it would be this amazing renaissance that the data was undeniable, where medication use went down, when people's sense of depression, apathy, suicide would go down almost instantaneously. And they were testing it first in retirement homes and elderly homes, that just by bringing, I think it was a cat, a dog, birds, and some plants. That's it. And the people's medication use for pain control went down. The suicidal, like the hallucinations that were coming up, so particular medications like Haldol, risperidone went down so intriguingly. And then system came in that they were started undercutting. They offered the same thing but a little bit less nature and a little bit less nature. And then the person who had created this, I forget the company name, eventually the board of directors were saying that in the name of profitability, this doesn't make sense to have nature in there anymore. And she left after, I think, 15 or 20 years, devastated that the nature that she had instilled had the system already eat that back up, and it was taken away. And then you look up, and I can only imagine what she feels, because I feel that on a regular basis, that when we are pulled far from our nature, which is how a lot of the systems are currently set up and how we interact with one another in the world, a human being gets to a place of relative loneliness because they're so far away from their own nature. And I can imagine the pain being quite pervasive and unavailable to be processed through. Whereas, like in the ER, I'll have patients come in and I'll ask them, like when we're going through discussing the mental health experience or challenge that they're having. I don't say the mental health problem ever. I don't use any of the labels that have been put in this like through mental health experience, through any healthcare practitioners or the ones that they carry, I don't use the identities. I explain it as like an experience. So rather than saying you have anxiety, it's you're experiencing anxiousness, and it makes it
Mhm.
more open and available so their nature can seep through. And in many instances, I'll prescribe on the other side of the prescription pad a layered prescription, which is go in water and tell me if anyone has ever hugged you as wholly as water does before. Go hug a tree. And doing these things that are simple nature reimmersions, again, reminds you of the nature within yourself. And I hope that as people reclaim this sense of capacity to connect with their own nature, as it sounds like your sense of relation was so profound there, you look up and you can relate to everything with so much more grace, softness, and all of the dynamic range that nature seems to provide. Is there a place in the world that you have particularly found resonance, that when you go back to, you've cultivated this deeper relationship of the nature there, but of the nature of yourself as well too? And
Yeah, I just want to applaud everything that you said. You're pointing to so many important things, from the way that the system is working against us and the way that monetization and transactional relationships are counter to the way that we exist with nature, and to how just adding medicine to a sick world doesn't make us any better, and
yeah.
how there really needs to be so much change. That was one of the things that was more and more clear as I was on my journey, is that I had always worked in this kind of whitewashed wellness model. I'd worked in retreat centers and hospitality and universities. And even when I would say we were getting to the root cause of something, this is the root cause, there was roots below the roots. The roots below
Yeah.
the roots was the whole system is jacked. Like, the roots is not, oh, it's your diet. No, it's like the food is terrible and you didn't grow it or harvest it yourself. And that's all part of the process of being human and having a really deep wellness, really optimal wellness. So I just want to applaud everything that you said, and I totally wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. In terms of my power places, New Mexico was unbelievably healing for me. It's not some place that I had ever looked at a map and thought I want to go to New Mexico, but a friend had invited me to Puerto Rico. I built an earth ship with her in Puerto Rico. It's
Mm.
this sustainable housing made out of tires and glass bottles and garbage, and it's turned into this beautiful art sculpture home that meets all the human needs. It's completely off grid. And I built one of those, and their academy was in Taos, New Mexico. And I fell in love with the crew that was there, and I decided to go and do the academy. And so I ended up in Taos, New Mexico. And it was the most vacant place I had ever been on the planet, meaning you look around and it looks like there's nothing there. And then in that vacancy, it was the most presence I ever felt anywhere. It was like the air was like thick with something that wasn't there. It was just so fantastic. It was just, and I would climb down the cliffs into the gorge, and I would jump from the hot spring to the cold river back to the hot springs again, and these horned rams would come down and
Okay.
stare at you, and there was like tarantulas and desert sage and sunsets that like wrapped around you and went for miles, and the whole thing was. And then on the radio in Taos, the radio stations play local music, and some of the local music is the Native American communities that live
Wow.
there. So you would be driving and all of a sudden you would hear these like Native American songs and chants on the radio, and the whole thing was just surreal. And then I moved in with the medicine woman there, and I started working with peyote, and we were preparing peyote for ceremonies and working with the local Native American church, and just like touching and holding and being in relationship with peyote on a daily basis was so life changing. The whole thing was so life changing. It's, for me, it almost feels like something you look back on and you're like, did that really happen? Because now
Mhm.
I'm in Florida and I'm in like a studio apartment in Florida, and my cat's jumping on me, and I'm podcasting with you, and it's, wait a minute, like, did that really happen? That's the level of kind of extraordinariness that it embodied. So I would say that's probably top of my list in recent memory.
That really, what you said had my body shake because of, if I were to, I asked myself the question as I asked it, I'm saying, do you have one specific place? And then, yeah, Monument Valley at the border of Arizona and Utah has exactly how you described it, this expansive vastness that you can't, it's beyond the words, the feeling, but you feel the nature and the rawness, and the silence is so deafening. And the way that as the sun sets and rises there, and you're peppered with the most beautiful view of the universe above you, the sky is just, you're absolutely reconnected, and you recognize that you are as much that as it is you. And I wonder if I would have heard that from a doctor before, if I would have thought that they were losing their mind and they should check into a mental health facility. But that is the most medicine nature. I'm not pointing to a religious up there. That's like the arguably the big universal orgasm is up there. And we are as
It's
much that.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I love that you touched on the sense of timelessness that you reclaimed, because how amazing it is as these living beings that we can go into these periods of dissociating and then reassociating. And then the association is, wow, the presence of here. And on the other side, where I long for individuals and I remember that time where you felt that you were stuck forever, and the healing process that you went through, sometimes maybe pushed into, or in other times you invited yourself in. Sounds, it really brought all of it together. Where, do you have any anger or frustration towards any parts of you or anything that you have experienced at all? Is there anything that remains
Nothing.
there?
Nothing. When I think about my ex-boyfriend, I get a little bit mad because he's a dick, but
Contacted
like,
you? Has he contacted you, or have you done any healing process in there? Things like uncoupling ceremonies. Have you?
yeah, not with him, because I think there are certain people, I think you have to be careful. I think we have a Pollyanna view of closure on things. And I think with some people, that's really good work. And with some people, I think some people, you go no contact and you stay no contact. And that's
Mhm.
where I'm at with this person. And that's what's best for my physical and mental health with this person. But I've done all the work on my own to work on that. And honestly, it doesn't bother me that much. But I don't like all the stuff that happened with my family, like all that. I feel just serenity and acceptance. There's very few things now that I activate me in a negative way, like very few things. I have I can't I think it's because of the plant medicine a lot too. I don't have the I'm not as trigger happy as I was. Like there's just a lot more spaciousness before I get frustrated, or before I get sad, or before I get depressed, or before I get anxious. It
Mhm.
takes quite a bit. And my recovery is a lot faster. I was the type of person that my recovery could be days or weeks for something that was pretty minor for somebody else. I remember an incident that happened, I think it was like 2017 or 18. Someone had intentionally vandalized my car. And it was a couple of weeks because it was with a knife. I had a soft top car, and someone had taken a knife to the top of my car and cut it
Wow.
open. And as soon as I found the car, I had a panic attack, which lasted for 3 days. And then I was like shaken about it for a few weeks. And I can feel now what it felt like to feel that. And I can also feel a space from it, which I think when you have really good, when you have really solid mental health, I think you can, like you mentioned, the observer, you can observe things and go, oh, that's upsetting, but I still have some space from it. There's still a little bit of a space there. There's still a little bit of a witness. I can still find my healthy coping mechanisms. I don't have to just all of a sudden be drowning in this emotion. And so all of that has shifted for me. My body is very different than it was a few years ago. I
Okay.
physically feel different I think I even physically look different. Like when I look at photos of myself from a few years ago, I think I even physically look like a very different person.
I think it's a very important thing, and I'd love to hear about it, because I remember you mentioning that your perception, and I think it's important to hear from people who have gone through not medical, educational systems that have part of it that almost puts aside the benefit of psychedelics. And I remember you saying that you had a renaissance of shifting the perspective of what you thought it was. Could you maybe share about what you thought it was before, and then what steps you went to reconsider that, and what came about after.
Yeah, I grew up in the post-Nixon war on drugs. And when I would think about drugs, I would think about those images from the 60s where someone was having a psychotic break and they were on a gurney in a hospital. I fully ingested and absorbed all the propaganda around war on drugs. My father, like I said, was a physician. And my mother was hardcore Catholic. And so it was like sex and drugs and like the taboo topics were just, yeah, reinforced at home and at school and in the meet. So yeah. And then I had friends at school who were doing drugs recreationally, but they were always the losers, right? They were the stoners and they were that's not what like a good girl does. A good girl gets straight A's and a good girl, I was like in the good girl mode. And I was like that for my whole life. I hardly ever drank. I was very straight and narrow. And because it was so embedded in the Western medical model, I always took medication for all my problems. It was like first line of defense was always pharmaceuticals, whether it was a cold, an infection, a migraine, a whatever. It was like meds. You take meds
Yeah.
for that. That's what you meds. And my dad had a pharmacy in the kitchen cabinets, like all the drugs you could, and like we didn't even need a prescription. We just go to the cabinet and take the meds we needed. It was just like meds.
Yeah.
And now I look back at it and I'm like, again, really? I'm like, wow. Okay. And now I have a cabinet in my bathroom and it's filled with tinctures and there's passion flower and there's kava and there's mother's wort and there's a whole bunch of vitamins and there's echinacea. And so now that's what my cabinet looks like. And even this morning I felt like, oh, am I getting a little bit sick? So I made some lemon water. I ate a piece of garlic. So now that's the methodology that I use for my personal health. But literally my encounter with peyote that I mentioned completely changed my life because peyote had such a sentience that in my mind, like medicine was over here and plants were over there. And I didn't even really have a feeling of plants having sentience. I definitely didn't have a feeling of plants having sentience, having medicinal value. And I definitely didn't have a sense of that value being higher in the hierarchy than pharmaceuticals. So like all of that needed to shift for me. That whole thing needed to collapse and I needed to make a huge paradigm shift, which I did. And it was mostly meeting peyote because peyote is so alive. And I don't know if it's a he, she, I call her she, like she just had such like a delightful and sweet and loving energy. And I was only microdosing her and she was just so great. And I was like, oh, medicine could be alive. Like it could be an aliveness. And that aliveness is like nature, and that nature is like sentience, and all of that is I'm in relationship with all of that. And that's actually what health is. Health is actually being in alignment and resonance with all of this. And I'm not a machine that has parts that needs more oil or more transmission fluid. This whole thing is not what I am. And that's like a breakdown of a whole
Well,
indoctrination and rebuilding a whole new situation.
when I hear a lot of people who are in the contemplation of going from no chance I can do it to a curiosity, but I'm terrified, they're at a point maybe where they have such a sensitivity that they're experiencing that they're terrified that if they do this, they're going to go crazy. But I sometimes come back to, is it not crazy to carry on coping in such a way? And they almost have to get to this point where the pain pendulum swings and it says it's more painful for me not to do it. I can't carry on like this anymore. But I would love for us, our pain point, to not be the only thing that drives us in our world. And at some point when you say, whoa, I didn't go crazy when I did this. And of course it has to be done with, ideally with great reverence, and the setting is so appropriate. And that's why I'm so grateful that Third Wave is one of the examples of guidance for people to have effective experiences that minimize the opportunity for people to have what people would say is the word crazy, but moments where they fragment further and it exacerbates some hurt that is very difficult to come back, at least on their own and at least on the timeline that they expected. So like when you have an individual who is very sensitive and terrified of, if I do that, how would you invite them into the reconsideration?
I think everyone has to reach it at their own pace. I think it's like when you're ready, the teacher will appear. I would only ever describe the tremendous healing and regeneration and freedom that I've experienced. And as I talk about that to some people who are experiencing that fear that you're describing, I do see a shift in them and they go, "Oh, maybe I could do that too." Like I do, but I'm only just coming from a place of telling my personal experience and allowing that vibration and that story to either resonate with them or not. And because I think that if someone is going into these medicines with that amount of fear, there could potentially be a negative outcome. There has to be some sort of readiness and surrender to these medicines, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think a person has to get there and feel that, okay. And I think that just comes also from trusting the person who's giving the information. Like people trust me, I'm trustworthy. I've been
Mhm.
doing this work for a very long time. And so they're more likely to trust me than they are to trust like a blog or a podcast or by running
Western
the weed
doctors,
shop.
honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. 'Cause
Yeah. So I think that's where I think, again, story has this powerful impact. And I think it activates within other people a desire to do something. And by us sharing our positive experiences with psychedelics, I think it could be a catalyst for other people trying them.
I love how you stated that. And I've come to think and invite to people, maybe this is what it is, that psychedelics invite you to some perceptions. And I like that you said sentient, because the conscious intelligence that's there is absolutely remarkable. But I invite them to recognizing in the ER very often, because they're highly suggestible to the healthcare and God archetype or caregiver archetype that a healthcare provider plays. And so in awareness of that, I want to be very mindful of how I'm approaching and inviting certain things that can shift the perspective that I see as bearing so much weight on them. And I invite them to think you don't have to go necessarily to a psychedelic first. You can have a psychedelic moment, for example, in having a real and raw conversation, maybe first with yourself. Maybe that happens with a journal. And then maybe the conversation can be real and raw with an individual in a way that you haven't been able to relate or be available before. And that is arguably psychedelia in its form, because there's an opportunity to continue on in a particular way, and there's a response that has more of you intentional, aware, and available to potentially witnessing yourself completely not in line with the story that you've been carrying thus far. And where psychedelics almost say, hey, I know you're seeing that, but you're going through anyway. You can have small tastes of that that allow you to prepare, and it can be with medicine or without. And I'm sure Stan Groff, when acid was no
Yeah.
longer available, he went through an
Yeah.
existential reflection of how can I still touch the miraculous of what I did? And he came upon holotropic breath work. And
Hmm.
breath is available to literally everyone. And so in the EO, have
Hmm.
some people do breathing exercises. And personally, having done many medicines, breath has taken me as far, if not further. And so you don't have to go to the Amazon. You don't have to go to any type of medicine experience that goes into your body. You can literally connect with your breath in a different way and unlock a lifetime of parts of you that have been yearning to connect. And maybe the healing commences first through breath.
Amen.
Yeah. um, is there an invitation that really stands out from you, from your book, that is a point of reflection that invites people into their own layers, that as a curiosity for them to deepen it, and looking at the story through your book, All of This Healing is Killing Me, a 15-year memoir that has been revised at least 3 times, if not many thousands in the psyche. Is there something that comes forward for you? Because I want to honor your time, of course.
Yeah. I think if the title resonates with you, then the book is meant for you. And I honestly say that not for my own gain, only because this is meant to be a gift. I've
Mhm.
spent a lot more time and money on this than I'm ever going to get back. So it's meant to be a gift. And I think if the title resonates, I think you should pick it up. And most people, if not all the people who have read it, have told me they picked it up, they couldn't put it down, they were done with it in a couple of hours. So I definitely think it's something that you can completely consume in a day, and it will make you think about your life. And I think the unexamined life, as they say, is not as good as the examined life. So I think it's worth picking up if the title means something to you.
And I'd love to also reflect that the inactive service, when a book is truly written in a way that the relatability for an individual has them available to moments and present to their life to a greater degree, there's a currency that's to be factored in there that is beyond any dollar that we don't know of, but it is a bank that pays dividends exponentially, not just on an individual level, but on a societal level, because that type of energy proliferates as an individual has more of them available, and they are more graced with their own life experience for the mortal beings that we are, that are finite.
Yay!
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for allowing me to share some of my story and some of the things that I'm passionate about. I really appreciate this platform and this conversation, and you're really good at asking questions. So,
Thank you. This felt like I was truly scattered and not bringing questions forward organically. And I'm like, that's because of the night shift or whatever. There's a story that's sold. But I really actually look forward to us speaking again, because as you're deepening your relationship to, I don't know how long you've been with Third Wave, but what they represent is, I think, of one aspect of something that I feel is the most important renaissance that's happening in the human experience right now, that will liberate and expand
we'll
for
have to
your
do
work.
a part 2 conversation.
I'd love
I
to.
feel like we could spend many more hours having this conversation.
Beautiful. I want to thank you and your cat for taking the time.
Who's now passed out on my lap since she did all her laps.
Right when you were mentioning the observer, she came around behind you. I don't know if you noticed that. And she's like, "Are you talking about me? Are you talking about me?" Thank you again for your honesty, truth, and vulnerability, both in this podcast and in particular in the book. And I look forward to engaging with it myself and dialoguing with it. And I cannot wait for the moment when I hear someone has brought that book forward and that was the thing that shifted them. And then one day it's on par in dialogue with The Body Keeps the Score and All of This Healing is Killing Me. Maybe on the same shelf one day.
Yes, let's do it. Woo!
All right, Gabby, thank you.
It's such a gift what you're doing. It's incredible. So cool. Like, you're just the coolest doctor. I wish I had a doctor, when I needed a doctor.
Consider me an
All the
ally.
doctors
Thank you, Gabby.
No, thank you so much. It was great to connect.
Likewise. Take care. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast with my guest, Dr. Gabrielle Pelicci, who wrote the book, All of This Healing is Killing Me. All of her links will be available in the show notes below. Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this with anyone that you feel might resonate or connect with some of the things, or maybe even needs to hear what was discussed in this podcast. Please take a few minutes after this podcast to, before you go to the next thing, contemplate, digest, and integrate some of the things that may have come up for you. I look forward to seeing you on the next podcast. Have a beautiful day. Consider leaving a review and rating the podcast. I'm not going to tell you what to rate. You do as you feel. And please, before this podcast ends and you go on to the next thing, take 3 to 5 minutes in silence to allow some of the information that you heard to be contemplated, digested, and integrated. To the degree that every experience has a moment to actually have it be processed, it has a greater chance for it to be instilled into your life. I wish the rest of your day and week is beautiful. Take care, remain curious, and don't forget to play.